Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. Today, we'll explore a mystery hidden in the shadowy mountains of North Carolina that hasn't been solved for more than a century. Tell me where you're seeing this video from in the comments section before we start. If anyone wants to join us on this investigation, please let me know. The year was 1912. The atrocities of the Great War had not yet been felt by the world. However, in the remote areas of the other forms of dread already existed in little towns' imaginations in the Appalachian Mountains. At that time, North Carolina was a state of stark contrasts. The mountains to the west were essentially unaffected by development, whereas cities like Charlotte and Raleigh were witnessing the first signs of modernity with electric street vehicles and growing textile mills. Families adhering to centuries-old customs lived there amid mist-covered peaks and deep valleys with little sunlight, many of them descended from the original Irish and Scottish immigrants who came over the Atlantic Ocean centuries before. In that area, the Appalachian Mountains created a natural maze of slender paths, uncharted caverns, and forests so thick that even the most seasoned hunters were hesitant to go out by themselves. Black bears, bobcats, and poisonous snakes were among the wildlife. However, many villagers whispered around campfires that nature wasn't always the main threat. There were legends of people who went into those woods and just vanished, as though the mountain had parted its lips and engulfed them completely. At the age of 23, Margaret Hale's name became associated with one of the most unsettling mysteries ever discovered in that area. She wasn't a contentious or dramatic person. On the contrary, everyone who knew her characterized her as a typical young lady with a shy smile and a nice personality. Margaret, the daughter of a modest farmer in Haywood County, spent her childhood taking care of her younger siblings and assisting her mother with housework. Her dad, on land that had been in the family for 3 generations, the stern yet fair man cultivated grain and tobacco. Up until it wasn't, life was predictable yet challenging. Margaret was scheduled to go on a straightforward trip in early March of that year. Her maternal aunt, who resided on a property some 15 kilometers distant, had become very unwell. Margaret, who was always loyal to her family, offered to take care of the woman for a few days since she didn't have any children of her own. The trip necessitated traversing 2 small mountains and traveling down a path referred to locally as the Cedar Way, due to the old trees that bordered the path. Margaret had traveled this path previously, always with a companion but never by herself. Margaret bid her parents farewell on the morning of March 15th, a gloomy day with low clouds promising rain. He carried a small vial of medication her mother had made using medicinal herbs, a bundle of clothes, and some food wrapped in linen. She wore faded leather boots, a woolen shawl, and a dark blue dress. Although her father was reluctant to let her leave on her own, the situation provided no substitute. Since his brothers were working on the spring planting, he was unable to put the work on hold. Margaret told everyone that she would arrive before nightfall because she was familiar with the journey. She was never able to visit her aunt. The fact that she was never seen alive again is much more unsettling. Margaret's aunt started to worry as dusk came over the mountains that Friday, and she didn't show up. To see if anything had happened, she dispatched a neighbor. The man came back, following the same path. Margaret would have taken, but the young lady was nowhere to be seen. It was almost dark when they arrived at the Hale farm, and when they learned that Margaret had not shown up, their anxiety developed into complete panic. Her father set up a search party right away. In the early hours of Saturday morning, some 20 local men set out with weapons, torches, and flashlights. Calling Margaret's name until they found her, they combed the cedar trail inch by inch. There were no indications of violence or conflict along the trail. There was no drag marks, ripped cloth, or blood. Margaret seemed to have just vanished into the thin alpine air. The hunt went on nonstop for 3 days. Experienced men who were familiar with every tree and rock in the area ventured farther and farther away from the original path. They examined old, deserted wells as well as caverns and ravines. They asked everyone who lived on the surrounding homes, but nobody had reported seeing Margaret go by. She seemed to have vanished from the world the instant she left her parents' home. The whole community was stunned. In their churches, women prayed. Men formed search parties that grew more and more frantic. After being informed, the county sheriff showed up with 2 deputies. However, no tangible leads surfaced despite official reinforcements. With unbreakable silence, the mountains guarded their secret. Then everything changed on the morning of March 19th. A young hunter named Thomas Brennan made the decision to investigate a more isolated region, since he was familiar with rarely used back paths. He followed a dark intuition and ascended a rocky route that led to Raven Rock, a craggy plateau that most people avoid because of old beliefs. There, in a tiny clearing encircled by twisted oaks, Thomas discovered something that would chill him to the bone. Give it another go. I keep editing the second half. There was no logical explanation that Appalachian mountain people could provide for what Thomas Brennan found that chilly March morning. Nearly 2 miles from the Cedar Trail, Raven Rock was a remote, rocky outcrop. To get there, a total detour from Margaret's planned path, traversing an icy creek that flowed between slick boulders and up steep hills covered with thick vegetation. There was no rational reason for anyone to travel that distance, much less a young woman traveling alone with her luggage and eager to get to her destination before dusk. With caution, Thomas moved toward the clearing. There was a thicker, different silence, as though even insects and birds shied away from this area. In the middle of the open area, encircled by an almost exact circle of stones, that Margaret Hale's body lay where it appeared to have been placed on purpose. In a strangely symmetrical, almost ceremonial stance, she laid on her back with her arms outstretched at her sides. She had an expression on her face that Thomas could never quite explain as her open eyes gazed up at the bleak sky. It wasn't precisely pain or dread. She felt as though she had witnessed something that the human mind was not designed to see, something more profound and unsettling, a sort of spiritual fear. Margaret's dark blue dress. Despite the unfathomable distance from the main trail, the clothing she had on when she left home remained undamaged and free of mud stains. After a difficult hike over rough ground, her boots showed no signs of wear and were pristine. Beside her, the medication bottle and the bundle of garments were placed with care, as though someone wanted to maintain decorum and order. However, Margaret's hands held the most unsettling detail, the one that would keep investigators up for weeks. She grasped a tiny branch of hemlock, a deadly plant that is well known in the area but is not thought to grow natively at this elevation. Her pale fingers were entwined, her fists clenched around the branch as though she had grasped it in her last moments. There was also more. Someone had tied a crude necklace of little bird bones and weaved twigs around Margaret's neck. When she left home, she didn't wear it. Horrified, her parents would subsequently attest to this. This unsettling item. Someone else had put them there. In addition to the physical strain, Thomas's breathing was labored by the terror of what he had seen. He staggered over his own legs as he rushed down the mountain to seek assistance. A few hours later, the scene was precisely as Thomas had described when the sheriff and a group of men arrived at Crow Rock. Dr. Jonathan Pritchard, a white-haired county physician, was summoned to view the body. He worked quietly, kneeling next to Margaret as the other guys continued to. A polite distance, with many of them unable to see the scene up close. No indications of apparent physical assault were discovered by Dr. Pritchard. No injuries, bruising, or indications of strangling were present. There was no sign of an assault, and Margaret's clothing was intact. With shaky hands, the doctor meticulously examined every visible area of her body, taking notes in a little notebook. Margaret most certainly passed away on the same Friday she vanished, or, at the latest, the Saturday after. However, the reason of death was still a mystery. A 23-year-old lady in good health had just stopped living, and there was no reason why. The first unsettling theory was raised by the hemlock branch in Margaret's hands. Had she consumed a portion of the toxic herb? However, why? Margaret didn't exhibit any depressive or hopeless symptoms. Even though they were thrilled about the chance to assist her ailing aunt, her relatives insisted she was all right. And why, even if she had made the decision to end her own life? Would she have traveled miles across impassable terrain to a remote place she probably didn't even know? And who had put that necklace made of macabre around her neck? The body was ordered to be returned to town by the sheriff. In a silent and solemn procession that would be known for decades, 6 men came down the mountain with Margaret on a handmade stretcher. The discovery rapidly became well known in nearby areas. What started off as a frantic hunt for a young woman who had gone missing had evolved into something more darker, a puzzle that defied reason and logic. The sheriff interrogated numerous people over the course of the following few days. At first, he suspected the young hunter might be involved and asked Thomas Brennan a number of questions. How, after all, had he known just where to look? Why had he chosen to ascend to Raven Rock, which was outside the boundaries of the designated search area? Under all the conceivable penalties, Thomas vowed that he had simply acted on a gut instinct, an unexplained sensation that had driven him there. Numerous locals attested to Thomas's reputation as a respectable, diligent, and truthful young man. Other than the unsettling coincidence that he was the one who discovered the body, there was no reason to suspect him. Then the sheriff focused on Margaret's relatives. Was there a quarrel or secret that could account for what had transpired? Concerning their daughter's private life, the parents were questioned. Were there any suitors for Margaret? Had she recently experienced a breakup? Did she communicate with anyone outside of the area? Every question had the same response. Margaret was a quiet young lady who had no known romantic relationships and was loyal to her family. Her life was straightforward and predictable, centered on family responsibilities and housework. Margaret heard the aunt she was going to see in her hospital bed. When she learned of her niece's passing, the already weak woman from the disease became even more incapacitated. She verified through tears that she had sent a message for assistance, but she never thought tragedy would ensue. Nobody she knew would want Margaret to suffer. Everyone who knew the young lady loved her. In the meantime, rumors started to circulate like wildfire throughout the highlands. Superstitions that date back to the earliest settlers and have been passed down through the generations have reappeared with new vigor. The stories of Raven Rock, a location that the elders had long believed to be cursed, were discussed in whispers. Decades, or even centuries ago, they claimed, there had been a horrible incident. Some described the sinister rites carried out by isolated mountain hermits. Others described hostile spirits that lived on the highest peaks and enticed unwary travelers into lethal traps. During Margaret's funeral, Reverend Samuel Kirby, the practical pastor of the local Baptist church, attempted to diffuse the tension. He gave sermons on the enigmas of divine will and the necessity of believing in heavenly justice in the face of earthly justice. Fails. But there was a hint of doubt in even his firm voice. Everyone felt that there was something seriously wrong with the death, something that went beyond typical explanations of common foul play or accident. On a soggy March afternoon, Margaret was laid to rest in the tiny churchyard. Numerous mourners, many from far-off villages, attended. Margaret's mother sobbed among the old headstones as she fell over the casket. With his eyes set on a far-off spot in the mountains, her father stood as stiff as a stone statue, as though he was looking for solutions in the same rock formations that had engulfed his daughter. Give it another go. R goes on. Edit the third section. There were more questions than answers in the weeks after Margaret Hale's funeral. William Tesla, the Haywood County Sheriff, had been in these mountains for more than 20 years, but he had never dealt with a case this complicated. Unaffected by superstition or fantastical tales, he was renowned for his rigorous and logical approach. However, even Tesla was starting to see that something. There was something unexplainable about the death that went beyond standard investigative techniques. In search of a rational answer, the sheriff planned a trip back to Crow Rock. This time, in addition to deputies, he brought along a state surveyor who was surveying the mountains in the region. The objective was to record the exact location of Margaret's discovery and check for any evidence that might have been missed at the time of the body's discovery. On a bright April morning, the expedition set out as spring was. The Appalachian foothills are finally starting to warm. The mystery was only made more complex by what they discovered at Raven Rock. The stone circle surrounding Margaret's discovery was still in place. Sheriff Tesla commanded that every stone be inspected, turned over, and scrutinized. The circle's creation was unsettlingly exact, nearly geometric in its perfection, despite the fact that the stones were common local granite and quartz with no inscriptions or unique markings. It had taken a long time for someone to arrange the stones in that certain manner. But why and when? Henry Caldwell, the surveyor, was a courteous man who took meticulous measurements and thorough notes. He verified that Margaret would have taken the Cedar Trail, which was 2.5 miles away from the location. The most direct path between the two locations would involve going through very challenging terrain, such as a steep climb with a gradient of around 45 degrees in some spots. Even with the right gear, Caldwell, who was used to walking mountains for work, acknowledged that the trip would be difficult, as well as daylight. It would be almost hard for a young woman with a bundle of possessions, dressed in long skirts and scuffed boots. Then, Tesla posed an important query. Was there a more straightforward way to go to Raven Rock? The surveyor looked at his maps and took the terrain into account. He clarified that there was another trail that circled the mountain's base and then climbed a kinder slope to the plateau. This path would be more practical, even if it would be longer, perhaps 3 miles, for a person who has never gone climbing. The group made the decision to investigate this path. They discovered something unsettling as they downed the other trail. They discovered a piece of dark blue cloth fastened to a low-lying branch in a small area between two rock formations. Margaret's dress was made of the same material. The sheriff marked the precise position in his notebook and stored the evidence with care. Margaret's passing in that direction was verified by this, but it also brought up a more unsettling query. Had she been? It indicated that she had purposefully veered off course by taking this different route. Why? There had been no reports of fog or bad weather that day, but had she gotten lost? If she wasn't lost, was she being forced or guided by someone? As they descended farther, they discovered another trace approximately 1 kilometer from the mountain's base. A little footprint in the parched mud by a creek. It looked like a woman's footwear in Margaret's size. There were bigger marks next to this footprint, undoubtedly. Male. Tesla's heart was pounding. At last, tangible proof that Margaret wasn't alone. But the scars were old, worn down by time and weather. Whether they were from the same day Margaret vanished or weeks earlier could not be ascertained. At dusk, the expedition made its way back to town, and Tesla convened a conference with the men who had taken part in the initial search. He raised a pointed question while presenting his findings. During the 3-day hunt, had anyone looked into this alternate trail? The response was depressing. It led in the other direction to Margaret's aunt's house, so nobody had thought of it. Since the searchers had assumed that any deviations would be brief and unintentional, they had concentrated their efforts on the direct route and the surrounding areas. Nobody had thought Margaret could have been guided miles in the wrong direction or chosen to walk. Tesla then conducted more research. He started interviewing people who lived on the other trail. The majority were alone. Families surrounded by small farms in modest cottages. Throughout the year, these people saw very few outsiders, and each visitation would be seen and remembered. Tesla asked each person individually if they had seen Margaret or anyone suspicious in the days leading up to March 15th. Most didn't have anything to say. However, Tesla later encountered an elderly widow called Eliza Drummond in a particularly remote cottage a mile from Raven Rock. 3 winters prior, her husband had passed away from pneumonia, leaving the woman to live alone. She maintained a small vegetable garden and a few poultry, hardly visiting the city more than once a month to buy necessities. Eliza's expression changed when Tesla brought up Margaret Hale's passing. She paused before speaking, her gaze narrowing. She had seen something, she acknowledged at last. Eliza heard voices on the afternoon of March 15th, right before sunset, as she was drawing water from a well behind her cabin. The trail next to her property wasn't often traveled, so this was unique. She slipped over to the window and peered through the faded curtains to see 2 figures walking along the trail. One was obviously a young woman carrying a bundle in a dark dress, and the other was a tall man wearing dark clothing and a wide-brimmed hat that covered his face. They were walking close to each other, but Eliza was unable to hear what they were saying. The sheriff was excited to finally have a witness, so he pressed Eliza for more information. Did the young woman seem distressed or forced? Eliza frowned, trying to remember what she had seen that afternoon. Not exactly, she said, adding that the young woman didn't appear to be resisting or struggling, but rather was moving slowly and mechanically, almost as if in a trance. Eliza also noticed something else, only after the 2 figures had vanished around the bend in the trail. The man wasn't moving normally. His strides were too long, his posture was too rigid, and there was something seriously wrong with the way he moved. Couldn't quite put her finger on it. Tesla asked if she recognized the man. Could he be someone from the area? Eliza shook her head, saying that she had never seen this person before, and that she knew almost every adult male within a 10-mile radius. She was certain that this was a stranger. The sheriff then posed the most crucial question. Why hadn't Eliza reported this earlier? Why hadn't she called the police when she discovered a young woman was missing? Eliza's response was unsettling. Fearful, she locked all the doors and windows in her cabin that night after seeing the 2 figures, and she didn't leave until noon. Something about the 2 people, particularly the man, gave her an unexplainable sense of dread. And even now, weeks later, she still felt a chill down her spine when she remembered the way he moved, as if his limbs didn't fully obey the laws of human movement. Eliza was a woman who had lived alone in the mountains for years, having braved storms and bears without flinching. Tesla left Eliza's cabin with more questions than answers. Who was this mysterious man? How had he persuaded Margaret to stray from her path and follow him for miles through the mountains? And what was so unsettling about his appearance and movements that had scared a mountain woman used to all kinds of hardship? The sheriff knew he had to find this man, but he had no name, no facial description, and essentially nothing but Eliza Drummond's hazy description gave Sheriff Tesla a new direction for his investigation, and he returned to town and started methodically questioning every merchant, innkeeper, and tavern owner in Wood County. Did anyone see a tall, dark-dressed man, possibly traveling alone? North Carolina at the time had its share of travelers. Try again. Our Continue Edit Part 4. Eliza Drummond's testimony of an elderly widow who spoke of forebodings and irrational fears. Peddlers, itinerant preachers, and seasonal workers, but the majority of these visitors stayed on the main roads and avoided the remote mountain trails. The responses were confusing. Some merchants recalled strangers, but their descriptions were ambiguous and contradictory. The hardware salesman mentioned a tall man who had purchased supplies in early March, but he was unable to recall specifics. The proprietor of the town's only inn remembered a number of visitors during that time, but none of them precisely fit the description. Tesla then focused on the county archives, spending days poring over dusty documents in search of similar cases that might provide some clue, as if the mysterious man had appeared and vanished without a trace, a fleeting shadow in the mountains. What he discovered was both frightening and fascinating. Over the previous 3 decades, there had been at least 6 reports of unexplained disappearances in the mountains surrounding Raven Rock, most of which involved lone travelers, people who, in 1896, 16 years before Margaret's death, a young itinerant preacher named Ezekiel Moody vanished while traveling between 2 small mountain communities, and his body was discovered 2 weeks later in a ravine less than 2 miles from Raven Rock. 3 of these cases were never solved, and the bodies were never found. The other 3 ended with the discovery of remains under strange circumstances. One case in particular caught Tesla's attention. When Tesla looked deeper into the files, he found something even more unsettling. The sheriff who looked into the Ezekiel Moody case in 1896 was a man named Abraham Colra. According to official records, Colra maintained a strange object in his hands, a small crucifix made of intertwined twigs that was definitely not his. The circumstances were uncannily similar. Additionally, there were no signs of violence, and his clothes were intact. Tesla's heart raced as he read Colt Train's personal notes scribbled in the margins of documents, observations that were never included in the official reports. In one of these notes, Colt Train mentioned interviewing a hermit who lived in the mountains and claimed to have seen Preacher Moody walking toward the highest peaks with a tall man dressed in dark clothing. The hermit had described the stranger as having a strange, almost unnatural gait. Those words were almost exactly the same description Eliza Drummond had provided. Could the same man have been involved in both cases 16 years apart? That would mean the suspect was at least 40 or 50 years old now, possibly older. Tesla looked for more information about the hermit Colt Train mentioned, but the name didn't show up anywhere else. It appeared that this witness, like so many other aspects of these cases, had vanished into the shadows of the mountains. Determined to find answers, Tesla did something out of the ordinary. Invited all of the local elders to a public meeting at the Baptist church, explaining that if there was a pattern to these disappearances, if there were legends or stories that could help solve the mystery, the elders would be the ones to preserve that knowledge. On the selected night, roughly 40 people showed up, packing the small church's wooden pews, and the flickering of candlelight on the walls created dancing shadows that seemed to heighten the eerie atmosphere. The Margaret Hale case discussed earlier cases he had found in the archives and asked anyone to share any information, no matter how odd or improbable. There was an awkward silence during which people looked at each other, obviously reluctant to speak. Eventually, an elderly man in the last row, Josiah Blackwell, 82, who had been born and raised in these mountains, just like his father and grandfather before him, slowly stood up, leaning on a cane, and started speaking in a firm but hoarse-like voice. According to Josiah, the Native Americans who lived in the area long before European settlers arrived knew Crow Rock. They called it a place that Josiah couldn't pronounce correctly, but it meant something like a place where spirits pass through, and it was considered a place of power, but also of great danger. The stories he was about to tell, he said, were considered superstition by most people, tall tales meant to scare children, but there was truth in them, he believed. When the first settlers arrived in the 1700s, they disregarded the warnings and never went to the area after sunset. Some even attempted to establish farms close to Crow Rock. But strange things started to happen. Livestock vanished. Children claimed to see a tall man watching them from the trees at dusk, and some people who ventured too close to the rocky plateau returned, changed. Speaking in a confused voice, their eyes glazed over as if they had witnessed something in their minds. Cannot comprehend. The farms were eventually deserted, and people learned to stay away from the area. But there was more. Josiah went on. There had always been stories about a creature that lived in the highest mountains for generations. Though he assumed human form, he was not quite a man. He didn't look quite material, but he wasn't quite a spirit either. He was referred to by several names by the elders: the Shadow Guide, the Walker, the Unnamed One. They claimed that he showed up for lonely people, particularly those going through times of vulnerability or uncertainty. He possessed the ability to sway people's thoughts such that they would voluntarily accompany him to the most lonely and remote locations in the mountains. Something occurred there. Something that killed, but not just any death. The victims appeared to have been drained of their lifeblood, leaving behind nothing but empty shells. The church was completely silent. A few shook their heads, obviously doubtful of Josiah's story. However, others nodded in, particularly the older ones. Concur. Their parents and grandparents had told them the same tales. Sheriff Tesla and Reverend Kirby, who were chairing the meeting, cleared their throats. Uncomfortably, in an attempt to soften Josiah's story, he said that they were only folk tales that originated from people's innate terror of the vastness and solitude of the mountains. Josiah wasn't done, though. Even the skeptics were startled by what he said. During the Civil War in the 1860s, a group. Confederate soldiers were attempting to evade Union patrols by traveling across the highlands. There were 7 men in those woods. They were in a deep state of shock, and only 3 came out. They were discovered murmuring unintelligibly while meandering in circles close to a tiny settlement. Days passed before they were able to speak clearly again. Their narrative was scary when they were able to finally explain what had transpired. Unaware of Raven Rock's reputation, they had set up camp close by. At night, as if they were sleepwalking, their friend simply stood up and started to move toward the woodland. He fought with unexpected power when they attempted to restrain him and eventually managed to get away. Over the course of the next few nights, the other 3 guys who vanished followed suit, getting out of their sleeping bags and into the shadowy forest as though they were puppets moved by unseen strings. Too scared to attempt to save their friends, the 3 survivors ran away at first light on the 4th day. Give it another go. Proceed. Edit Section 5. The assembly was clearly uncomfortable after hearing Josiah Blackwell's story. A man of law and logic, Sheriff Tesla was faced with a decision. Given how similar the stories were to the Margaret Hale case and the other disappearances listed in the county records, he couldn't just write them off as superstition. However, he was unable to disclose in an official report that he was looking into the potential involvement of a supernatural entity in the fatalities. He can lose his job as a result of this and become a laughingstock. Following the discussion, Tesla pondered the facts in his head for many restless nights. He was honest with himself, but he was also a practical man. Margaret's case contained aspects that resisted easy answers: the unattainable distance she covered, the macabre necklace, the transcendent dread Thomas Brennan described, the expression on her face when she was discovered, and the absence of traces of struggle or violence. With the hemlock branch gripped in her hands, the twigs and bird bones, and now Eliza Drummond's testimony about the tall man with strange motions mirroring accounts dating back decades, if not centuries, Tesla made a final effort to locate hard proof. He planned a fresh trip to Raven Rock, this time with a clear goal. In order to determine whether the stone circle had ever been utilized for nefarious reasons, he intended to excavate the area around it in search of buried remains. He took 4 reliable. Among the men accompanying him was a muscular farmer named Marcus Henley, who was renowned for his daring and physical prowess. On a dreary May morning, they arrived to the rocky plateau. The mountains were covered in a verdant blanket of fresh vegetation, a transformation brought about by spring. However, Raven Rock remained solemn, as though the season had not been able to break through the place's gloom. The guys got to work, carefully excavating inside and around the stone circle with pickaxes and shovels. Because the earth was dense and rocky, the labor was difficult. Following, Marcus Henley discovered something unsettling after about 3 hours of digging. He hit something with his shovel that wasn't a rock or a root. He got down on his knees and started to delicately remove the earth with his hands. All the men recoiled involuntarily at what came up out of the frozen ground. There were several human skulls, each one little and delicate, and obviously belonging to a youngster or adolescent. As they dug deeper in that area, they discovered more bones, not just from one person, but from multiple people. Tesla sensed his. The blood ran cold. They had discovered something much bigger than they had anticipated. The men meticulously documented every discovery for the remainder of that day and a portion of the following. They discovered the remains of at least 5 distinct people, all buried at different depths within and around the stone circle. The earth and the passage of time had discolored some of the very old bones. Others were more recent. They also discovered some unsettling items among the bones, made small amulets. Like the necklace Margaret was wearing when she was discovered, it was made of entwined twigs, scraps of decaying fabric, an unreadable inscription on a corroded silver medallion, a collection of tiny animal bones, primarily those of birds, arranged in geometric patterns as though they had been a part of some sort of ritual, was even stranger. Tesla mandated that every remnant be meticulously gathered and delivered to the city. They called in Dr. Pritchard to examine the bones. The old doctor was employed by days in his temporary office, making the most of what he knew about anatomy at the time. He came to a somber conclusion. 3 adult women, a teenage girl, and a child of about 10 years old, possibly a boy, are represented by the bones. The remains ranged in age from relatively recent, possibly a few years old, to very old, possibly 50 or 60. The mountain towns were hit by the news like wildfire. In addition to being the scene of an enigmatic death, Raven Rock appears to have been a covert graveyard, a location where several victims had been abducted throughout the years. Now, Tesla has to deal with a far more intricate probe. He started comparing the discovered remains with missing people records from nearby counties and the county archives. Numerous matches were found. The teenager might be Sarah Winters, who vanished while gathering berries in the mountains in 1887. Catherine Morrison, a widow who vanished in 1892 while visiting a friend on a trip, was probably one of the older ladies. Remote farm. The child might be young Timothy Oakes, who was split up from his parents in 1879 while traveling through the highlands. The identity of the remaining victims were obscured by the passage of time, and they were never identified. The most startling finding, however, was made when Tesla looked into the personal belongings discovered among the bones. There was still a chain connecting to the corroded silver medallion. A portion of the inscription was readable when Dr. Pritchard thoroughly cleaned it using mild solvents. It was only 2 letters, M and E. A shiver went down Tesla's spine as he reviewed his data. His initials were Ezekiel Moody, the traveling preacher who vanished in 1896. Additionally, Moody was known to wear a silver medallion that his mother had given him, according to the papers. This indicated that Moody's body had been transported. It was discovered in a gully 2 miles from Raven Rock. Before abandoning the remains in the ravine, someone or something had first taken him there, possibly as part of a ceremony. Ultimately found. However, why do this? Why were the victims relocated to Raven Rock? Most significantly, what or who had been engaging in this behavior for so long? After compiling all the information, Tesla tried to create a timeline. The emerging pattern seemed unsettling. Someone would vanish in the highlands close to Raven Rock around every few years, occasionally at longer intervals. Not every victim was located. Some just disappeared without a trace. However, those who were located shared similar traits. No indications of violence, odd items they were holding, and a look of unfathomable fear. Something seemed to be feeding on the area, picking victims on a regular basis using a logic that was incomprehensible to humans. After then, the sheriff made a contentious choice. He employed Arthur Whitman, a young assistant professor at the University of North Carolina who was researching Appalachian customs. In June, Whitman moved to Hood County, thrilled to have the chance to look into He spent weeks interviewing senior citizens in this intricate case, gathering oral traditions, folklore, and stories. What Whitman found was frightening as well as fascinating. Many generations and various families told the same tales about the walker, or the creature that lived in the mountain heights. As with any oral tradition, there were, of course, differences in the specifics, but the essential components stayed the same. A tall, dark creature with movements that weren't really human, the capacity to manipulate people's thoughts and persuade them to follow him voluntarily. Victims are invariably found dead in remote, high places with no apparent reason. Whitman also found an intriguing item in the historical records of the university. Early in the 18th century, French settlers were documented exploring portions of the Appalachians. Some write in their diaries about native stories of mountain ghosts who took on human form and preyed on lone travelers. In 1723, a Jesuit missionary reported hearing tales of a demon that inhabited the highest summits, a beast that the locals feared more than any enemy, human or wild. Equipped with this knowledge, Whitman proposed a theory to Tesla. Maybe there was something in the mountains that neither he nor the sheriff could adequately explain using the logic and science of the day. Something that had been in that area for centuries, if not millennia, could have served as the basis for the mythology. Whitman did not imply that it was inherently a supernatural being in the conventional sense. It might be an unexplained natural phenomena that had strange effects on people's minds and was connected to the geology or unusual atmosphere of those mountains. Tesla listened politely but didn't change his mind. He was not a cult scholar or an academic. He was a man of law. He required hard proof, an actual suspect who could be detained and put on trial. But as the months went by and nothing changed, he started to come to terms with a harsh reality. This might have been a case. Things would never be resolved to a satisfactory degree. Maybe all the victims, over the years, including Margaret Hale, were merely names on a sinister list of inexplicable mountain riddles. Give it another go. Proceed. Edit, Section 6. The Appalachian Mountains experienced severe heat during the summer of 1912, but there was also a sense of unease that seemed to pervade every farm, every community, and every lonely mountain trail. What had been a singular, terrible instance at Raven Rock has become far more significant with the finding of several remains, and darker. Children were kept close to home by families. Routes that went too near this cursed area were avoided by travelers. And at night, in living rooms and pubs, people whispered to each other about what really lived in the shadowy mountains. Sheriff Tesla persisted with his inquiry, but he took a new tack this time. He could at least attempt to stop the phenomenon if he was unable to explain it. He set up routine patrols on the most remote paths, particularly those that led to the greatest peaks. At key locations, he erected warning signs cautioning visitors not to deviate from the major routes and never, ever, to continue traveling after dark. In many societies, escort systems were put in place so that people always traveled in groups of 3 or more. However, resources were scarce and the mountains were enormous. Tesla covered hundreds of square miles with just 6 deputies. Every path and isolated pass was impossible to keep an eye on, and there was an increasing feeling that anything, given the danger, it was shrewd enough to evade patrols and patient enough to wait for favorable circumstances. The story was further complicated in August when Arthur Whitman found a discovery in the archives of the local library. He discovered the journal of Nathaniel Grayson, a trapper who had lived in the highlands in the 1840s. For months, Grayson lived alone in the woods, trapping beavers and other creatures to sell their pelts. His journal, written in handwriting that was almost unreadable, recorded his everyday experiences, but it also included unsettling sections about unusual occurrences. Grayson said in his October 1843 journal that he saw a tall guy walking by himself along a far-off ridge at a height where no normal person would have any need to be. Grayson was drawn to the man's long, crooked strides, which seemed to traverse impossibly great distances. As Grayson peered through his crude telescope, an unexplained terror sprang in his chest. He stated that the man appeared to be looking for something, moving his head in an unnatural manner. Even more unsettling, Grayson reported discovering the body of a teenage hunter who had vanished from that area weeks later. The body was positioned strangely with hands folded across his chest and a twig and feather necklace around his neck. The discovery so unsettled Grayson that he left his traps there and never came back. He composed a statement that Whitman would highlight a number of times in his notes. Something old and ravenous that feeds not on flesh but on something more profound and valuable exists in the heights and is not a part of the human world. After Whitman informed Tesla of this discovery, the two men spoke about the ramifications for the entire afternoon. If Grayson was reporting on actual occurrences that occurred in 1843, then the pattern of unusual deaths and disappearances had been going on for at least 70 years, if not longer. Furthermore, if the tall man's descriptions were accurate, they were either dealing with something that didn't age or die like regular people over the course of all those decades, or it was a succession of unique people upholding some sort of macabre custom or ritual. Tesla favored accepting the second theory. In the most distant areas of the mountains, there might have been a cult or secluded family that passed on its evil traditions from one generation to the next. However, this explanation was not without flaws. Why had there never been any proof of permanent living at the heights at which the victims were transported? Why had patrols never seen cottages, campfires, or any indication that people were still there? Something happened in September that rocked the investigation as a whole. A young guy called Robert Fisher, one of Tesla's deputies, vanished while on a routine patrol in the highlands. Born and reared in the region, Fisher was a seasoned individual who knew both the paths and the route to his own house. One bright morning he had set out with Henry Walsh, another deputy, was assigned to inspect the routes close to Raven Rock's location at the foot of the mountain. As Tesla had directed, the two guys strolled side by side while keeping eye contact. However, at midday, as they were eating and resting by a stream, Fisher announced that he had to take a quick break for personal reasons. As he waited for his partner to return, Walsh nodded and carried on eating his sandwich. After 5, 10, and 15 minutes, Walsh became anxious and asked for Fisher. There was no response. He stood up and found nothing but thick foliage and trees as they followed Fisher's path. He yelled once more loudly. Nothing. The woodland was completely silent. It was thick and weird. Walsh called the police and hurried back to the closest petrol station. Tesla launched a massive search right away. For 3 days in a row, over 50 men searched the area. They brought in sniffer dogs from a nearby county. They proceeded approximately 100 yards past the location along Fisher's trail, where he was last spotted by Walsh. However, the trail terminated abruptly, as though Fisher had disappeared into thin air. Beyond that point, the dogs were unable to detect any scent and were disoriented, circling. One of the groups discovered something on the 4th day of the search that made everyone shudder. There was a circle of stones in a tiny clearing around 2 kilometers from Fisher's disappearance. It was a smaller, but no less accurate geometric creation than Raven Rock. Additionally, there were footprints in the middle of the circle. Boot prints the same size as Fisher's, and larger, deeper footprints from someone considerably taller or heavier next to them. The 2 footprint traces blended together as though 2 persons had walked side by side before abruptly ceasing to exist in the middle of the circle and going missing for no apparent reason. Fearing the worst, Tesla ordered the place excavated, but they discovered no bones, no body, and no indication that Fisher had been buried there. He seems to have strolled to that circle, after which it vanished from the physical world. For an additional week, the search was conducted in ever further off places. Robert Fisher, however, was never located. Like so many before him, he had just vanished, engulfed by the mountains. The community and the investigation itself were significantly impacted by the disappearance of one of Tesla's own deputies. No one was safe if even armed, skilled men working in pairs weren't. Morale fell. A few other deputies asked. Change of assignment. Whole families started thinking about fleeing the highlands in search of safer, more crowded places. Tesla was in dire straits. He requested state support in letters to the North Carolina governor. He went into great detail about the circumstances, including the finding of several corpses and the unsettling trends he had seen over many years. The answer from the state government was depressing. They dispatched an investigator who visited the area for 3 days, spoke with multiple people, examined Tesla's records before returning to the capital, with the conclusion that the sheriff was handling a string of crimes carried out by 1 or more people, most likely criminals or hermits hiding in the mountains. The investigator volunteered to send some state policemen for a short time and suggested conducting more methodical searches. However, Tesla was aware that this issue couldn't be resolved by regular soldiers. Regardless of the threat's nature, it was much more complicated and elusive than a straightforward human criminal. He started to experience frustration and the weight of aging. After spending months on this case and witnessing evidence that contradicted his beliefs about the nature of reality, he was now farther away from a solution than he had been at the start. Conversely, Arthur Whitman was more certain than ever that they were dealing with something extraordinary. He assembled all of his findings into an extensive paper that included historical narratives, indigenous myths, disappearance patterns, and ubiquitous traits of the victims. He came to the conclusion that the mountains were home to a phenomenon that modern science was unable to fully explain. He hypothesized that the area might have special geological or atmospheric characteristics that led to altered states of consciousness, which made individuals act impulsively and endanger themselves. Give it another go. R goes on, edit. Section 7. With its vivid hues of red and gold, autumn arrived in the highlands, but the splendor of the season was unable to mask the sense of dread that had descended upon Haywood County. When trees lose their leaves, the slopes become more bare. And as winter drew near, folks were ready for both the cold and the loneliness that came with the snow. Many hoped that any dangers lurking in the heights would likewise withdraw as the severe winter approached, and go into some sort of hibernation until the next spring. Due to the strain of the past few months, Sheriff Tesla, who is now clearly older, Many people regarded this choice as desperate. He arranged a huge expedition to the highest and most isolated areas of the Alps, calling upon all the willing men in the area. The goal was clear-cut and easy to accomplish. Look for any signs of human habitation, such as a cave, hut, or other building that the person responsible for the disappearances might have used as a hiding spot. They needed a place to live and a place to hide, whether they were a family of criminals, a cult, or a demented hermit. For the expedition, 63 men volunteered. They split up into 7 groups, each with a skilled leader and enough supplies for 5 days. They carried ropes, climbing equipment, guns, and comprehensive maps made by surveyor Henry Caldwell. On a chilly October morning, the expedition headed out, climbing different paths to reach the highest summits. Determined to set an example and discover solutions, even if it meant putting his own life in danger, Tesla followed one of the groups. Although taxing, the first 2 days went without incident. The teams investigated deep caverns, some of which were obviously unexplored before, frequented by people. They explored hidden ravines, scaled perilous cliffs, and looked into every rock structure that may offer cover. At the upper elevations, they discovered animal bones, bare footprints, and other indications of natural predators, but no proof of a long-term human presence. Marcus Henley, the same farmer who had assisted with the excavations at Corvo Rock, led one of the parties that discovered an unsettling discovery on the 3rd day, in a very isolated area of the mountain, reachable only by a challenging. They discovered a large, deep cave after climbing a steep rock face. The inside opened into a naturally occurring cavern of astounding proportions, yet the entrance was small and easily missed by anyone not looking. The men stopped dead in their tracks as they noticed something within the cave by the light of their torches. They were all unfamiliar with the weird symbols that covered the cave walls. Some of the elder males were aware that they were not Native American pictographs. They were distinct, more geometric, similar to an unfamiliar notation system or language. There were hundreds of bones on the cave floor, largely animal bones, but also some clearly human bones, placed in circular patterns. Marcus Henley was aware that before they touched anything, they had to record everything. In order to notify Tesla, he hurried down the mountain, leaving 2 men to watch the cave entrance. The following day, Arthur Whitman, excited to study the markings on the walls, arrived with the sheriff. What they witnessed validated their darkest fears. Suspicions. The cave appears to have been a ritual site used repeatedly over a long period of time, in addition to being a place to hide. Whitman meticulously drew the symbols in his notebook as he studied them for hours. He saw that some of the symbols were relatively new, with lines still visible, while others looked extremely old, weathered by time and moisture. This implied that many people or organizations had been using the location for decades, if not centuries. The symbols were not in line with any writing system Whitman was familiar with, yet there were recurring themes that alluded to a purpose or meaning. The bones were gathered and inspected. Despite his elderly age, Dr. Pritchard, who had ascended the mountain, recognized at least 3 distinct human bones in the collection. Some had been bleached by time and were very old. Others were more recent and still had connective tissue remnants. Additionally, personal items were strewn all throughout the cave. Rusted buttons, pieces of rotten cloth, a child's leather shoe that was almost completely destroyed, and oddly, a few little metal items, such as a wedding ring, some old pennies, and a belt buckle. However, what wasn't in the cave was more unsettling than what was. There was no proof that anyone had made it their permanent home. There were no signs of bedding, cooking implements, fires, or anything else that would be expected in a human home. Although it wasn't a dwelling, The cave was undoubtedly utilized for something. It was a location of visiting, where customs were carried out before being put on hold until the following event. Tesla gave the order for lookouts to be placed covertly close to the cave, tucked away among the trees and rocks, and instructed to keep an eye out for any movement and report it. Anyone would have their suspect at last if they went back to that location. The lookouts braved the rising autumn chill and the unsettling isolation at those high altitudes while working 12-hour shifts. Weeks went by, and yet no one showed up. The cave was quiet and deserted, protecting its secrets. Arthur Whitman, meanwhile, carried out his investigation with a fresh perspective. In an effort to locate any historical references to symbols resembling those discovered in the cave, he visited libraries in various sections of North Carolina and even as far as Virginia. At last, he discovered something in a Richmond University library that provided an interesting, if unsettling, hint. A heretical European cult from the 1700s was documented. They held the belief that there were entities that existed between the material and spiritual worlds. Realms, entities they referred to as world walkers. This cult engaged in ceremonies wherein human victims were offered to these spirits in return for power or knowledge, according to historical accounts. In the end, the European Church persecuted and exterminated the group. However, there was conjecture that some members had escaped to the New World and settled in isolated areas where they might carry on their customs covertly from the authorities. The symbols found in the historical records of sects were remarkably comparable to those that were discovered in the cave. Despite their differences, they had enough structural similarities to raise the possibility of a relationship. Whitman experienced a simultaneous surge of terror and excitement. If his theory was right, the disappearances in the mountains might be the result of a centuries-old occult tradition that has been passed down through the generations, rather than the actions of a single person or even a family of criminals. When he presented his research to Tesla, the company was not quite impressed. And doubt. Some of the most unusual parts of the case could not be explained by the existence of a cult operating in the highlands. The victims' unfathomable travel distances, the absence of any indications of fight, the looks of transcendent fear on their faces, and the tall man's strange motions were all detailed by several witnesses throughout the years. There were aspects that went beyond the description of a demented religious cult. November, when the first snowfall has already covered the highest summits, something happened that would make the story even more mysterious. An experienced hunter called Daniel Crawford, one of the lookouts stationed close to the cave, descended off the mountain in a condition of severe shock. His eyes were wide, he was trembling violently, and it took him many hours to speak clearly. When he did talk, it was a horrifying tale. Daniel heard something when he was on his midnight shift. It wasn't the sound of animals or the wind in a typical woodland. It resembled a voice, but warped, reverberating as if it were coming from every angle at once. With his weapon pressed to his chest, he crouched behind the rocks where he was hiding. Then he noticed something climbing towards the cave in the shadows. It was a very tall figure that moved with the peculiarity that so many witnesses had reported. Its strides covered distances that shouldn't be conceivable, and its limbs appeared to bend at slightly odd angles. Daniel wanted to yell, shoot, and do anything, but discovered that he was totally immobilized. He was imprisoned by something more profound than mere terror, as though his will had momentarily lost control over his body. All he could do was observe as the person moved closer to the cave's entrance. Daniel stated that he briefly saw the creature's face turn toward him in the faint moonlight. He felt as though something not quite human was watching him, but he was unable to identify any features. The figure then went inside the cave and vanished. Give it another go. R goes on. Edit Section 8. It took Daniel Crawford what seemed like an eternity to regain his motor abilities. The utter panic that overtook any impulse to stay at his position caused him to stumble down the mountain in the dark, scraping himself on rocks and branches when he eventually managed to move again. He continued to run until he arrived at the first occupied cabin, which was over 3 miles away. At that point, he beat on the door so forcefully that he roused the whole family. Between weeping and uncontrollable trembling, he started to shout as he described what he had witnessed. The following morning, Sheriff Tesla assembled 15 armed men and ascended to the cave. With their weapons drawn and ready for anything, they approached with cautious caution. The entrance to the cave was just as they had left it. The little coating of snow that had fallen overnight contained no new footprints. There was no indication that anyone had gone through. After lighting a lamp, Tesla and the other men went into the main chamber. At first sight, nothing appeared to have changed. The arrangements of bones on the floor and the symbols on the walls. Everything had its proper place. Marcus Henley, however, saw something different. A new circle of stones, smaller than the others, had appeared in the middle of the cave where there had been an empty area, and something inside of it caused all the men to unconsciously shudder. The deputy badge belonged to Robert Fisher, the guy who vanished in September. The metal was spotless, polished, and nearly shining in the torchlight, as though it had been meticulously constructed and set there as a trophy or an offering. Although Fisher's body had not yet been located, the discovery verified that he was deceased. Additionally, it verified that, as Daniel Crawford had claimed, someone or something had visited the cave at night. However, how could this being get in and out of the snow without making any footprints? How had it gotten past the other lookouts stationed at different locations throughout the region? There were no answers to these queries, defying all reason and logic. Tesla had to make a tough choice. He gave the order to use mortar and stones to plug the cave's entrance. He would forbid anyone who came back if this location was utilized for evil rites. He admitted that it was a desperate move, but in order to end the mortality cycle that had afflicted these mountains for so long, he felt compelled to take any action. For 2 days, 12 guys worked to close the entry completely. They transported up the mountain in buckets, stacking massive stones and using mortar to fill in the spaces. When they were done, the cave's entrance was entirely covered and concealed behind a wall of stone that fit in with the mountain's natural rock face. This should be sufficient, Tesla hoped. He thought he could finally put an end to the disappearances by preventing access to the ritual site. However, he understood in his heart that it was probably just a short-term solution. A stone wall would scarcely be a lasting barrier if something had been working in those mountains for decades, or even millennia. In December 1912, winter hit with full force. A thick layer of snow covered the mountains, preventing access to the higher trails. Communities withdrew to their houses, where they waited out the cold months while burning wood in their fires. No additional disappearances occurred over the winter. People started to exhale in relief, whispering that maybe the worst was behind them and that maybe the cave had been successfully sealed. During those winter months, Arthur Whitman wrote a thorough report on all he had learned. He painstakingly recorded the myths, historical narratives, and trends of disappearances, as well as all the tangible proof he had gathered. The scientific world at the time would generally disregard his findings after it was published in an obscure academic publication, dismissing it as fantastical folklore combined with shoddy criminal investigations. Whitman, however, was aware that all of it was sincere. Anything that 1912 science just lacked the means to comprehend or explain. The spring of 1913 came sooner than anticipated. In March, the snow started to melt, reopening the roots and exposing the mountain slopes. There was new optimism with the thaw. Perhaps, just perhaps, the horror had ended. Families started going about their daily lives as usual. The mountain routes were once again used by tourists, although they continued to steer clear of the vicinity of Raven Rock and other places with dark connotations. As soon as the weather allowed, Tesla planned a verification mission. He wanted to make sure the cave seal was still in place. 8 men ascended to the location. It was a bright April morning. They were shocked and appalled by what they discovered. Their meticulously built stone wall was totally demolished, not only crumbled under the force of erosion or snow, but disassembled by purpose. Stones appeared to have been torn out by force and flung aside, since they were strewn all across the entrance. Some of the fragments of the mortar showed traces that seemed to have been created by hands, fingers that had scratched and pried through the solid substance. Tesla came into the cave with a heavy heart. With the exception of one unsettling addition, everything inside remained the same. The bones had now been arranged in a complex circular pattern in the middle of the main chamber, and something that chilled Tesla's blood was seated in the very middle of this pattern. It was a framed photo from the residence of the Hale family. The image, which was shot maybe a year before she passed away, showed Margaret Hale smiling softly before the camera. How did the picture end up there? Who had? Took it to this cursed location after stealing it from the family home? More rape? Tesla was infuriated in a way he had never been before by this affront to Margaret's memory and the pain of her family. He virtually bolted from the cave and yelled to the deserted mountains, challenging whoever or whatever was doing this to confront him head-on rather than duck into the shadows. His voice resounded over the peaks and valleys, but the uncaring quiet of nature was the only answer. The men who are going with. He was worried about Tesla's emotional condition. After months of disappointment and failure, he was obviously at his breaking point. Marcus Henley gently urged him to descend off the mountain, saying that they should reconsider their strategy and that shouting while standing there would not resolve the issue. Tesla reluctantly consented, but it was evident to all that something inside of him had just snapped. The knowledge that he was up against something he couldn't even understand, let alone defeat, had at last broken through his barriers of professionalism and reason. Tesla turned into a shadow of his former self in the weeks that followed. He continued to carry out his responsibilities as sheriff, but lacked the vigor and resolve that had always been his hallmark. He ate very little and slept very little. His wife was quite concerned and pleaded with him to drop the case, to acknowledge that certain problems were just unsolvable. However, Tesla was unable to let go. Ezekiel Moody, Catherine Morrison, Sarah Winters, Robert Fisher, Margaret Hale, and all of them. Justice was due to the victims and their families. He had failed to give them the answers they deserved. That year, in May, an unexpected event occurred. A letter without a return address showed up at the sheriff's office, the envelope soiled and tattered as though it had been aged or transported a great distance. Tesla's hands were shaking when he opened it. A single sheet of paper with a message written in tasteful but antiquated handwriting was found within. The message was brief and mysterious. The guard of the mountains is remembered. What is theirs is claimed by the mountains. Give up looking for things you will never find. Accept the mystery or join it. Arthur Whitman was shown the letter by Tesla and gave it a close look. The unusual-looking ink might have been handcrafted. The paper was of vintage quality, a type that is no longer widely used. Formal education, perhaps from the previous century, was indicated by the penmanship. However, who was the author? What's more, was the message a covert threat? Was the writer, implying that if he carried out further research, Tesla may vanish as well? Give it another go. R goes on. Edit Section 9. The investigation changed course as a result of the enigmatic letter, but not in the way Tesla had planned. The message reignited something inside him, rather than depressing him. The despair he had been experiencing was momentarily replaced with a furious determination. The fact that the perpetrator was bothering to deliver warnings indicated that their behavior was uncomfortable and that they were approaching to something significant. Regardless of the personal cost, Tesla made the decision that he would not give up. He started a fresh line of inquiry, this time concentrating on the oldest families in the area rather than the disappearances themselves. There must be some family history associated with these occasions if there was a secret custom being passed down through the generations. Tesla spent hours going through birth and death certificates, property records, and family trees dating back to the oldest settlers. Because the earliest records were usually inconsistent and inadequate, the job was laborious and frequently perplexing. However, trends started to show. A small number of households possessed property in the mountain's highest altitudes, properties that, since the beginning of colonization, had been handed down from generation to generation. He was particularly interested in one household, the Corvines, perhaps an Americanization of an original European name. It was a peculiar last name. The Corvines continued to. Remote property next to Raven Rock on the high slopes of a mountain. They had resided there since at least 1750, according to the documents. The oddity of the Corvines was that, despite their extended presence in the area, they were rarely mentioned in official documents. Birth and death certificates were strewn about, but there weren't many other records of contacts with institutions or authorities. They were seldom ever spotted in town, did not take part in local elections, and presumably lived in almost complete seclusion. According to property records, their farm had always passed to a single heir in each generation and had never been sold or divided. Tesla made the decision that he had to go to the Corvine estate. Marcus Henley and 2 other dependable men accompanied him. It took the better part of a day to reach the estate, traveling via narrow, badly maintained trails that progressively ascended through thick trees. The atmosphere appeared to alter more as they ascended. The light that is passing through. There was a spooky, almost greenish look to the treetops. They traveled in an eerie silence as the typical woodland, bird, and small animal sounds progressively diminished. They eventually arrived at a clearing where the Corvine mansion was located late in the afternoon. A farm in the traditional sense was not exactly what it was. A dark wooden home coated in lichen and moss was constructed from old timbers. There was only the lone cabin with no barns, planted fields, or indications of farming or cattle. Tiny, shadowy windows that appeared to be watching guests with vacant eyes. Tesla walked over to the door and gave it a solid knock. There was no response. Declaring himself the county sheriff, he knocked again, louder this time. Nothing yet. The door was unlocked when he tested the handle. He looked at his friends and pulled the door open slowly, causing a long, loud creak to open. Even though it was late April, the cabin's inside was chilly and dark. There wasn't much furniture, just the necessities: a primitive table, too, a small bed in a corner, and chairs. However, there was something spectacular covering the walls. Directly carved into the wood are hundreds or thousands of symbols, some deep and clearly very old, some shallow and more recent. These were the same kinds of symbols they had discovered in the cave, but they were much greater in size and covered almost all of the inner walls of the cabin. Tesla discovered a number of books and notebooks on the table. Carefully opening them, he saw that they included writing in the enigmatic letter's exquisite calligraphy. Although it was mostly in English, there were occasional words and phrases in other languages that he was unfamiliar with. It appeared to be a combination of philosophical insights, personal notes, and what could only be called ceremonial directions. As he started reading one of the paragraphs, Tesla experienced a chill. The text discussed the nature of reality and the overlapping but infrequently touched layers of existence. It made reference to things that were present in these strata in between, entities that were neither entirely material nor entirely spiritual. Importantly, it discussed how these entities need physical anchors, human beings who could act as bridges to allow for their transient appearance in our world. These people would get wisdom, longevity, and control over other people in exchange. While examining the rear of the cabin, Marcus Henley shouted out to Tesla in a hurry. Behind a bookshelf, he had discovered a secret entrance. The cellar, a deep hole in the ground beneath the cabin, was accessible through the entrance. With a flashlight in hand, Tesla cautiously made his way down the wooden steps. He began to doubt his own sanity after seeing what was in the cellar. The subterranean area was very spacious. Its walls were strengthened with wood and stone, and it was brimming with artifacts from people who had vanished throughout the years. Names and dates were written on the clothes, which were folded nicely. Photographs, medals, rings, watches, and other personal items were stacked on shelves. It resembled a macabre museum honoring the mountain victims. Some of the items were familiar to Tesla from instances he had looked into. There was a doll that had belonged to young Sarah Winters, the Bible of Ezekiel Moody, the pastor who vanished in 1896, and yes, more of Margaret Hale's clothing and possessions, including the shawl she was wearing on that fatal March morning when she left home. The portraits that hung on a wall in the basement, however, were the most unsettling. They were paintings in oil, performed with a great deal of talent, displaying the same person's face at several ages. It started with a 1762 portrait of a young guy who was probably in his 20s. Then there was an older 1791 portrait of what looked to be the same individual. Then another from 1823 and so forth. A journey spanning over 150 years. The same face, growing older but never passing away. The most recent image, taken in 1911, depicted a man who looked to be in his 60s or 70s but had eyes that were deep and ancientness that disguised his physical attributes. At that moment, Tesla realized the terrible reality. In the conventional sense, the Corvines were not a family. Through whatever agreement or technique he had discovered or created, they were a single person who survived generation after generation. And in some way, this person was taking advantage of the mountain victims, possibly depleting their life power to extend his own abnormal life. In some way, the beings described in the books were real, and this man had turned into their servant, enabling them. Manifestations in the real world in return for unattainable lifespan. Tesla collected as much proof as he could. He ordered his troops to seize the notebooks, personal items, and some of the victims' photos. If the cabin's occupant ever came back, they had to leave before he did. They were frozen in place when they heard a sound as they ascended back to the main cabin. Outside, footsteps. Deliberate, slow steps toward the open door. Give it another go. Complete the last section and be asked to. Part 10 of the Register Edit. As the footsteps got closer, the four guys stood motionless inside the cabin, their hearts racing. Marcus Henley and the other two guys, both armed, withdrew to the room's corners as Tesla, holding his revolver in sweaty hands, stood next to the entrance. At the threshold, the footsteps ceased. The uncomfortable silence seemed to go on forever. Then, gradually, a shadow moved across the aperture. What entered the room wasn't precisely what they anticipated. He was a normal-looking man, maybe in his 60s with graying hair and basic clothes like those of a farmhand. The fact that outsiders were in his cabin didn't appear to startle him. His expression actually gave the impression that he had been anticipating this visit for a considerable amount of time. But his eyes had that peculiar aspect, an ancient depth that contrasted with his otherwise unremarkable physical look, that Tesla had noted in the basement portraits. The man was neither angry nor afraid. Rather, he just sighed like someone who, after a long and exhausting trip, is finally coming to a finish. Tesla insisted on the man's identity while maintaining a pointed gun. The response was delivered in an unexpectedly gentle and courteous tone, with a hard-to-place accent that sounded like a mashup of numerous local influences gathered over an unbelievable period of time. He identified himself simply as Silas Corvine, although he acknowledged that this was only the most recent in a lengthy succession of identities and not his real name. He spoke in a composed manner without, attempting to avoid or thwart, as though he were at last relieved to be able to share his experience with someone who could at least somewhat comprehend it. Tesla would never fully mention what he disclosed in the hours that followed in his official reports because he was afraid he would be deemed insane. Silas clarified that he had fled religious persecution in Europe and arrived in the mountains in the middle of the 700s. He was a member of an old order that investigated the borders between various life planes, locations where reality grew more porous and thinner. He found that the Appalachian Mountains were one such location, particularly in some higher elevation regions where particular geological features produced peculiar circumstances. One such place was Raven Rock, a naturally occurring point of convergence where the boundary between worlds was especially brittle. He had communicated with the beings that lived in the spaces between, beings that existed in a form that was nearly impossible for the human mind to understand. In return for acting as their, he learned how to prolong his own life well beyond natural bounds by acting as a bridge that permitted their transient manifestations in the real world. However, there was a cost. To maintain their fear rays into the material realm, the entities needed life energy, and only living humans could provide this energy. Silas has played his part in that dreadful agreement for more than 150 years. He argued that he didn't pick his victims at random, as if it would make him less guilty. He awaited. Those who were vulnerable, isolated, or experiencing emotional instability or bewilderment. He could persuade them to voluntarily follow him to predetermined places during those times when the human mind was most vulnerable to control. The creatures took care of the rest, draining the life force in a manner that left the victims' faces etched with sublime fear when they finally realized what was happening to them. But now he was tired, Silas said wearily. Over a century and a half years of life had taken its toll. He had seen entire generations born and die while he stayed, caught in an unnatural cycle of renewal, and he had seen the world alter in ways he could never have predicted. And at last, a part of him, a remnant of the humanity he believed he had lost decades ago, was fighting back against the person he had become. Margaret Hale, he uttered in a weak voice, would be his final victim. He was at his limit. Tesla listened to everything with a mix of shock, incredulity, and, oddly, a trace of sympathy. However, the empathy was fleeting. Over the years, he thought of Robert Fisher, Margaret, her broken family, and all the other victims. He considered the lives that had been taken, the futures that had been denied, and the unimaginable pain that this guy and his terrible agreement had created. Tesla was aware that he would never be able to substantiate Silas's confessions. He had documents in his own journals, evidence from the cellar, and the victim's possessions, but no court would accept this account. He took Silas Corvine into custody, handcuffing him and starting the arduous ascent down the mountain that afternoon. Silas didn't say much while they were walking, but once he gazed at Tesla with those old eyes and said something the sheriff would never forget. He cautioned that there would be repercussions if the agreement was broken. The loss of their facilitator would be difficult for the organizations he had assisted. They would find another method to appear, or they would do much more harm out of rage over the broken pact. Recalling the mountains, he reiterated the enigmatic letter's words. The mountains stood guard, and they would always take back what was rightfully theirs. In a desperate attempt to intimidate, Tesla disregarded the warnings. Silas was booked into the local jail when they got in town at dusk. Over the course of the night, the sheriff documented everything he had discovered at the Corvine cabin and prepared his formal charges. He had enough tangible proof to at least keep Silas in jail while the investigation was underway, even though he knew the case would be complex and that many people wouldn't accept it. Went on. However, when Tesla got to the jail the following morning, he discovered that the cell was vacant. Silas Corvine was no longer there. The bars of iron were still in place. The windows were too small for anyone to pass through, and the door stayed locked. He seemed to have vanished into thin air throughout the night, as if he had just vanished. The on-duty guard said he didn't see or hear anything. When he examined the cell again at daylight, it was vacant, but it had been occupied during his nighttime patrols. Tesla set up a search right away, but he had a deep. It would be pointless to go down. Through means that are beyond the realm of common understanding, Silas had either been seized or had departed voluntarily. Naturally, Tesla kept the evidence he had gathered from the cabin and meticulously preserved it in the county archives. However, the case simply could not proceed in a traditional manner without the accused and a corpse to be tried. There were no other disappearances in the Highlands throughout the ensuing months. Raven Rock said nothing. People eventually went back to their regular schedules, but always with heightened vigilance when traversing the remote paths. All of Silas's revelations that afternoon at the cabin were never discussed in public by Tesla. According to his official report, he had discovered evidence that connected a suspect to several disappearances, but the culprit had fled before he could face charges. But Arthur Whitman knew the whole truth. Tesla had told him everything, and the young investigator documented every aspect in his own diaries. Whitman would go on to. After years of researching the mountains and their myths, a book on Appalachian folklore was eventually published, which featured sanitized versions of the Margaret Hale case and the mystery of Raven Rock. Decades later, new scholars who were interested in unexplained phenomena would rediscover the book, which had little circulation and was mostly disregarded by the academic community at the time. On Tesla's orders, the Corvine cabin was destroyed by fire. He desired to clean the area from the face of the earth, erase all evidence of what transpired there. For an entire night, the building was engulfed in flames that could be seen from miles away, resembling a massive funeral high in the mountains. Only burnt ground and charred stones were left when the ashes eventually cooled. 2 years later, in 1915, Tesla retired because he could no longer work at a job that had exposed parts of reality he would have liked to remain unaware of. He rarely discussed the case that had taken up so much of his life as he lived out his last years on his farm. He passed away in 1928, bringing many secrets to his death that he never told anyone, not even his family. Margaret Hale is still interred in the tiny Baptist churchyard, her plain monument designating a final, tranquil resting place. Her narrative, along with the stories of all the other mountain victims, has been woven into Appalachian folklore, and is now whispered on gloomy evenings as a warning to anyone who would think about going alone on the most secluded and remote trails. Of course, the mountains still exist. Magnificent and unconcerned with human misery, Raven Rock is still there, a silent monument to unsolved riddles. And occasionally, even now, there are accounts of lone travelers going missing for no apparent reason, leaving only unsolved mysteries and grieving, unsure families in their wake. Certain doors are unable to fully close once they are open. Once revealed, some facts cannot be forgotten, and some mountains conceal deeper, older mysteries. darker than any document from the past can describe. Join us on our ongoing trip through the most troubling cases in history. If this tale has unsettled you or sparked your interest in the dark secrets that lurk at the borders of our understandable reality. To ensure you don't miss any upcoming investigations, subscribe to the channel. Tell us what you thought of this story and where you were watching it in a comment. Additionally, if you know someone who appreciates real-life mysteries and tales that, share this video to challenge our preconceived notions about the world. Stories that have an unavoidable kernel of truth might occasionally be the scariest.